Oh, there we go. People are coming in. Good morning, everybody. We can see by the little participant counter that most of you are coming in now. We're going to wait just a second for that to stop advancing until we kind of know we have everyone. So give it just a moment, please. All right, looks like it has paused at about almost 120 of you all this morning. So we're very glad that you could be here for day 2 of ICAC Virtual Transfer Summit, our first ever. And I just want to, before I introduce our morning speaker, I just want to give some shout outs, some big thank yous to people. Day 1 was great. I want to thank Erin Hoover, who is a fantastic colleague and who's helped to make all the Zoom stuff work and been there for each of us who've presented and moderated. And I want to thank Kristen Smigilski, who's the chair of the planning committee, who's done a wonderful job. And we were just talking about the challenges of presenting in Zoom when you can't see your audience. So I just also want to give a big thank you to yesterday's keynote, Julian Parrott. So I don't have any idea if he's here, but I know I've talked to several people who we really enjoyed it, and it's difficult. Eric and I were just talking about that. When you can't see the people, you can't hear the people, you don't, get that visual feedback. But it's the best way that we could be together during this difficult time, and we did not want to miss Transfer Summit. So Dr. Eric Lichtenberger, my colleague and friend, he works at the Illinois Board of Higher Ed, and he is the data guru. That's what I call him, right? I'm kind of, I really get a lot out of the work that Eric does, because I think it really informs all the work that we do and helps kind of validate where we are in things and where we can do better. And to me, it's the best way to keep a pulse on what's happening in transfer in Illinois and beyond. So we really thank Eric for being here this morning and kicking off day 2. We're going to have a couple of things. First of all, I need to clarify, if you have a question, please put that in the Q&A box, not the chat box. I had some confusion about that, so some of you may as well. As Eric's moderator, I'm going to keep an eye on the Q&A box for him, and we will probably answer all the questions at the end. We're not going to stop for questions during. If it's something of a housekeeping matter that I can answer, I'll type an answer back, but otherwise we will Eric will answer all the questions live toward the end of the presentation. So please do, he would love to hear your questions and feedback, go ahead and put that in the Q&A. Also, this session is being recorded. And the other thing that I want to remind people, we do have some housekeeping items. Eric, can you share your screen for me again and show
I'm not
that
sharing
slide? Nope. It may be, there we go. Something's happening. There we go. So again, as we talked about, you can see and hear us, but we can't see and hear you. So that makes a challenge for both sides. But do again, please use a Q&A, and questions will be at the end. Hey, I remembered almost all of these without even having it in front of me. That were recorded. And well, it says we don't have all the answers. I'm not so sure about that. I think Eric may have all the answers for us. So we are going to give it our best shot. But anyway, I don't want to take up more of his time, because we're all excited to hear about the work that Eric's doing and how it can really help the work that we do. So without further ado, I'm going to give you Eric Lichtenberger.
So specific to the last 2 bullet points, the second to last one mentions that everything's being recorded and will be shared with all members. So if you suffer from insomnia, or you know of someone who suffers from insomnia, this could potentially be the cure. And specific to the last bullet point, as it mentions, we don't have all the answers. And one of my famous Mark Twain quotes, and I'm probably paraphrasing it, is wisdom is defined as one's ability to hide their ignorance. But I somewhat disagree with that now. I think what I've learned is I've kind of matured in my position is that we don't always have to answer all the questions, and sometimes trying to gets us into trouble. But with that being said, let me advance in my slide deck. So the title of my presentation is on Illinois transfer students and what we're doing at IBHE to focus more on outcome metrics to give the field more actionable information, while at the same time applying an equity lens. So before I begin with the formal part of my presentation, I would get in trouble with Ginger Ostro, I keep wanting to say that Ginger's our new executive director, but Ginger has been the IBHE executive director for a year now. But I'd get in trouble with Ginger if I didn't talk about the IBHE strategic plan that is currently underway. The Board of Higher Ed has the statutory responsibility to develop a strategic plan for higher ed. And we're supposed to do it, I think, once every decade, and we're a couple years behind. And I think that was one of the reasons why they brought Ginger Ostro in, was to help us create a strategic plan for higher ed that could move the state into the future. But as in a lot of our work, we're collaboratively working with the Community College Board and the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. We've created a strategic plan advisory committee that has broad representation across the P20 to workforce spectrum. And they in turn developed some strategies and created some design work groups around each of those strategies. And those design work groups are currently evaluating some of those strategies. And there is an initial draft of some of the strategies that are being considered. And if you'd like to provide some feedback, I guess I'll share this presentation later, but everything is linked to this slide. I think some of the current strategies do reflect issues that would be pertinent to those working in the transfer space. Okay, so I might mix up the agenda for today because Microsoft PowerPoint has kind of taken over my entire computer, and I'm afraid that I might not be able to get back to sharing my screen the way I'd like to if I switch back and forth. But I think at the last two presentations that occurred in February of the previous 2 years, I gave everybody an update about what we're doing with the transfer dashboards. So I think I'm going to do that at the end, so I don't have to toggle back and forth between my web browser and Microsoft PowerPoint. But we have some updates. We now are able to include majors of new transfer students from both the sending and receiving perspective. So it's something new that we currently have in a beta version, and it should be up in the regular version of our live site within a week or so. And then in the coming months, we're going to add outcomes, which kind of relates to what I'll be discussing. But before I focus on some of the outcomes for transfer students, I thought it might be important to provide some context regarding educational attainment within the state with an equity context. And so I'm going to begin by talking about some recent trends in educational attainment, as well as some recent enrollment trends. Unfortunately, some of the information that I'm going to present today hones in and drills down on the Illinois public universities, but in the near-term future, we're going to have this information for private colleges as well. And then we'll focus on some actual outcome information for transfer students while applying an equity lens, and I'll discuss why transfers are so important to the state and why they're often ignored nationally, and what we could do as a state to help fill that void. Okay, I'm going to do this at the end. My apologies. So what's the current educational attainment and equity context within the state of Illinois? As you can see on these wonderful maps, post-secondary attainment varies quite a bit across the state. And from 2013 to 2018, we have seen some improvement overall in terms of the proportion of the working age population that has a high quality degree or credential, but there are few Illinois counties who are on track for reaching 60% of the adult population with that high quality credential by 2025. And we have an interactive set of maps available at our website if you're interested in looking at some of this information. But essentially what this shows is that there is a geographic component to educational attainment, and there is quite a bit of variation across the state. And on top of that geographic variation, there's also a large variation in terms of race and ethnicity, and there are large attainment gaps between white and African American and Latinx adults. Here we see the wide variation. So close to 47% of white adults in Illinois have some sort of degree, so either an associate degree or higher, while for the Latinx population, it's closer to 20%, and for the African American population, it's closer to 30%. So in Illinois, we see variation in educational attainment, not only based on geography, but also based on race and ethnicity. And then in looking at a more national context, so how Illinois relates to the rest of the US states and territories, what we found in doing that comparison was that Illinois has the 11th largest bachelor's attainment gap between whites and African Americans. And it's fairly similar when we do a direct comparison between whites and the Latinx population. We have the 7th largest bachelor's attainment gap. And the interesting thing about Illinois, and I think it's one of the main reasons for the large gap, is that we have a solid higher education landscape within the state of Illinois that's somewhat bifurcated. So it seems to do a really, really good job of serving white students and Asian students, but not as good of a job serving African Americans and Latinx students, and hence the gaps. And that's something as the coordinating board within the state for higher education that we are hoping to address with our strategic plan. And based on population projections, what's interesting is that in the future, Illinois is only going to become more diverse. We're going to see a huge increase in the proportion of Latinx individuals within our population and Asian individuals. We're going to see a decline in the white population, and the African American population will decline slightly, but will remain relatively flat. On the positive side, more recently, the number of Illinois public high school graduates has increased, particularly the number of Latinx high school graduates and the number of African American high school graduates. But, and this is a big but, starting in 2026, the state's going to experience a robust decline in high school graduates overall. And it's happening in 2026 because of the economic downturn in 2008. I think what you could do as a researcher is backtrack key events. So in 2008, we suffered from the Great Recession, and the birth rate declined during that time frame. So 18 years later, what we're seeing is a smaller number of 18-year-olds and therefore a smaller number of high school graduates. I think you hear a lot of people quote these projections with the assumption that it's currently happening. And there will be a slight decline between now and in 2026, but the big decline is going to occur in 2026. And once again, I try to include the source information and links to it. So once I share this slide deck with everyone, feel free to look at these IBHE projections. They're actually pretty interesting, and they have parallel information for all 50 states. Oops, I skipped a slide. In working in collaboration with the State Board of Ed, they provided us with some information on college going rates of recent high school graduates. And what we also found was that there are gaps across the different race and ethnicity groups. About 71% of recent white high school graduates enroll in college within 18 months of graduating, while only 57% of Latinx and 55% of African American high school graduates enroll in college within that time frame. And then focusing on the individuals who do enroll, what we also see is differences in their college going patterns by race and ethnicity. With the chart with the green colors on the left, what it depicts is that over half of the Latinx high school graduates who are enrolling in college are enrolling at community colleges. And that differs for white and African Americans, in which slightly more than 60% of both of those populations are enrolling at four-year institutions. And then the bluish grayish bar chart on the right depicts the, sorry, my phone's going off. My apologies. It depicts whether individuals who enroll at four-year colleges are enrolling in-state or out of state, which gets at the out-migration information that people are always interested in. And as you can see here, there's also wide variation in these metrics. About 3/4 of four-year going Latinx high school graduates are enrolling within the state of Illinois, while 55% of white high school graduates who enroll at four-year colleges are enrolling outside the state. And with African American high school graduates who enroll at four-year colleges, it's almost an even 50-50 split. So we are losing some students, but that does vary by race and ethnicity. Some students to colleges and other states. We were also able to look at college going rates by socioeconomic status. And with the State Board of Ed, they tend to use whether one qualifies for free or reduced price lunch as a proxy for being from a low income background. And I don't think any of you would find this surprising. There's a huge variation when looking at college going rates by low income status. About 3/4 of the individuals who don't fall into that category enroll in college within 18 months, while slightly more than half of their low-income counterparts enroll in college. And there are some big differences in looking at where they enroll as well relative to two-year and four-year institutions. About half of low-income students enroll at community colleges, while 2/3 of the not low-income group enroll at four-year institutions. So once again, we see variation in college-going rates as well as the college-going patterns, which once again impacts educational attainment as a whole for the Illinois population. I also thought it might be important in light of COVID, and not to focus solely on COVID, just to provide some information about what's currently happening with college enrollment within the state. And this information is going to be specific to fall enrollment of this academic year. And I feel like some of this information may have direct implications for the potential pool of transfer students in the future, most notably the huge decline in community college students. I think if you look at the information that we typically embed within those transfer dashboards, one of the main sources of transfer students that are being received, actually across all sectors, the public universities, the not-for-profit private colleges, and the community colleges are community college students. So with a smaller pool of community college students, I worry that in the future, there are going to be fewer transfer students in general. But the community college enrollments were down, as were the enrollments of out-of-state institutions. Yeah, the state of Illinois is somewhat interesting in that we do grant operating authority to some out-of-state institutions within Illinois. So we have this strange sector that seems out of place. You know, for example, we have St. Louis University offering some courses and Lindenwood University offering some courses, and the University of Phoenix. So if that seems strange, that's what it is. But the public universities, their enrollment was slightly up overall. And I apologize that some of this picks on, I shouldn't say picks, but it highlights the public universities a little bit more. I'm able to capture more information more quickly from the public universities just due to some of our statutory authority. So focusing on the public universities, I guess the interesting thing is back in the summer, I think we were all worried that the public universities and all sectors would experience rather robust enrollment declines overall, but that really wasn't the case at the Illinois public universities. I think they strategically used some of the relief funding that was provided by the federal government to shore up their enrollments. So they actually had a slight increase in overall enrollment and a fairly robust increase in graduate and professional enrollments, and a small decline on the undergraduate side. But what's more interesting is that we also collected more nuanced enrollment information from the public universities specific to fall of academic year 2021. And specific to what we're talking about today, once again, this doesn't bode well for the future. What we saw was a fairly robust decline in new full-time transfer students at the Illinois public universities. And although the Illinois public universities as a whole only experienced a 1% decline in overall undergraduate enrollment, a lot of that was due to a huge increase in dual credit and dual enrollment, which mostly happened at Eastern Illinois University. So without that huge rapid increase in dual credit and dual enrollment, the decline on the undergraduate side probably would have been a little bit larger. And here's the information specific to how each public university did with new full-time transfer students last fall semester, and that the change from the previous fall semester. And there were actually a few institutions that experienced an increase, such as Western and the University of Illinois at Springfield and the University of Illinois at Chicago, and Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. So once again, I think the information becomes more interesting when you're able to drill down and look at the information by specific college, which is one of the things we're hoping to do with those transfer dashboards in the near future, and I will show them to you at the end. So another thing we're trying to do at IBHE is to provide more nuanced information and not just take a strict equity lens, but also look at the interaction of different variables such as race, ethnicity, and gender. And so this is kind of a manifestation of that. So not only are we looking at race and ethnicity, we're also disaggregating that information by gender as well. And what's interesting was that amongst the African-American population at Illinois public universities, it was actually fairly flat in terms of undergraduate enrollment overall. But if you look at the more nuanced enrollment types, what we see, and specific to transfers, since this is a transfer conference, was a robust decline in the number of new African-American transfer students and a huge gender gap within African-Americans. As depicted on this chart, what we could see is that the public universities in Illinois lost about a quarter of their male transfer students, but only 11.6% of their female transfer students. On the positive side, what we're seeing is fairly robust growth across all race and ethnic groups and all genders on the graduate and professional side. And that is likely due to individuals delaying their entry into the workforce by enrolling in graduate school due to COVID-19 and the weakened job market. Here's parallel information for Latinx students. Undergraduate growth was slightly larger for Latinx females than males. We also compared this information to what was going on nationally using information that the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center was putting out. So what we also found was that the decline of Latinx freshmen in Illinois was smaller than the national enrollment loss, which is a good thing, but we're still seeing moderate loss of new transfer students within the Latinx population. And once again, we see a slightly larger loss of male students. And then here's parallel information for white undergraduate students at Illinois public universities. And what we're seeing once again is gender differences. And what's interesting in terms of once we started applying this additional lens looking at gender differences is that within the higher ed space, females tend to have better outcomes relative to their male counterparts. But once we start looking at what happens in the workforce, that kind of flips, and males tend to have an advantage in terms of earnings. Okay, on to the next part of the discussion, which is going to focus on metrics for transfer students, which is what I think I marketed this presentation as. So here's some limitations of current outcomes metrics. So for the most part, there's a main national data source called IBHE that provides information that's standardized across all entities. It tends to focus on the institutions that are eligible for federal financial aid, which for the most part is all institutions operating within the state of Illinois. But the definitions have been established and standardized, and most schools engage in strict fidelity to those definitions. But one of the main limitations of using IBHE's data is that most of the measures are specific to first-time, full-time undergraduate students. And even though they focus on first-time, full-time cohorts, only some of that information that is outcome specific is disaggregated by race and ethnicity and gender. IBHE does include retention information for all colleges, but it's not disaggregated by race nor ethnicity. And in my opinion, one of the reasons why they focus on cohorts of new first-time, full-time students is that it's cleaner and it's easier. Once you start trying to establish cohorts of students who started elsewhere, it becomes a little bit more difficult to define them and to create parameters and to track those students through. But that's not a good reason for not doing it. There's also a time horizon issue with how some of the information is reported nationally. And the typical measure for tracking bachelor's degree completion and associate's degree completion and even certificate completion is to use 150% of normal time. And then if you're focusing on bachelor's degree students, what that requires is 6 years. And then if you're a researcher like me, sometimes what you want to do is use a rolling average to account for any year-over-year fluctuation or variation. You know, sometimes strange things may happen in 1 year, so it's good to use a couple data points to kind of even those fluctuations out. And I guess when you're using a 6-year time horizon and you're potentially using 3 different cohorts, well, in the end, what may happen is that you're looking at graduation rates of students who potentially started college a decade ago, which might not be the most actionable information. And once again, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be looking at graduation rates. I think it's highly important. But I guess what I'm saying is that perhaps we need to think of ways to look at information that's more recent and more actionable. And with some of this national information, there's also about an 18-month to 24-month lag in terms of when the information is reported and when it gets released. So I gave a series of presentations about the Illinois public universities in the fall, and we were looking at 6-year graduation rates. We used a 3-year rolling average, but most of the feedback I got, and I did get some constructive criticism from the folks to whom I was presenting this information, but it generally was about, you know, how useful some of the information was when the policy context is different and we're currently suffering from a pandemic. So going back 10 years and looking at information might not be the best thing to do. And are there other pieces of information that could we be looking at to make things more actionable and to drive policy? Also, that the National Student Clearinghouse used to provide state-specific information regarding transfer outcomes, but they haven't done that in a couple of years, despite Dina Lawrence asking Doug Shapiro at the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center to provide that information. And that was the information we used to create visualizations and research like this. That I think I've presented this at the last 2 conferences, but I would like to say that we're still #1 in the nation because the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center hasn't put any of the state level information out in the meantime. But with the last time they provided the information nationally and disaggregated the information by state, we were #1 in the nation in terms of community college students graduating with bachelor's degrees. And I could definitively say that's because of the work of the transfer coordinators and those who are involved in the Illinois Articulation Initiative. And another thing I always like to point out whenever I'm presenting this information is that our two main competitors, so Washington State and Iowa, are significantly smaller, and that the state of Illinois is much larger. It deals with many more students. It's much more diverse. So overall, we're experiencing, we are the national leader in this one specific transfer outcome with a more complicated and more robust higher education landscape. Not to downplay or dismiss what the state of Washington and Iowa are doing, but we're seeing huge success with a more complicated and system with significantly more students. So here's some recent work that we've been doing at IBHE specific to metric development and equity. So over the past few years, we've evolved from focusing on building and improving IBHE data collection processes to taking the information that we collected and transforming the information, or transforming that data into information. And one of the things that we've learned in doing that is the best way to get clean information that schools are comfortable with is to actually start presenting the information publicly. At that point, individuals may find something wrong or something off with the information, and we've created a process where individual institutions can make corrections. So putting things out in a public way, it tends to improve data quality, and it tends to improve the completeness of the information too. But we tend to socialize the information with the institutions in different ways to let them understand what we're hoping to do. So we've kind of created a process for the institutions to look at a lot of the information before we provide it in a public way. So we have set procedures for doing that as well. So what we hope to do at IBHE is to develop more actionable measures based on more recent cohorts and to provide additional disaggregation that's not available elsewhere. Like I said, IPEDS, the main source of higher ed data within the United States, doesn't disaggregate retention rates by race, ethnicity, or by low income status. So we figured if we could do that with the data we collect, it would be a definitive value add, and we'd be able to provide the field with more information that they could use to potentially drive change, or to figure out where we have relative successes and try to replicate those successes elsewhere. Another thing that we've been doing with the data that we now collect at the student level is to establish indicators for on-time graduation. And one of the metrics that we've been socializing with the public universities and the private universities is something that goes a little bit above and beyond year-over-year retention. We're also looking at class advancement. So among the students who are retained, we're also looking to see if they advanced in class status. And we're applying these same metrics to both new freshmen and to transfer students, which helps to fill some of the traditional informational voids. And then one of the things that we've been focusing on since Ginger Ostro started at IBHE as the executive director is to use an equity lens with everything that we're putting out and to create additional lenses. And we're starting to look at things such as urbanicity and rurality and family income. We don't have the information on locale and urbanicity and rurality yet, but we will in the future. So onto the actual outcome information. And I'm going to present this in a couple of different ways. And once again, some of the information drills down a little bit more deeply with the public universities. And that's only because I've engaged with the public universities a little bit more with the information and with the new metrics that we've created. So here's some information on both retention and class advancement of new transfer students from the fall of academic year 18-19 by sector. So once again, to the point that we want more actionable information and information that's more recent, what we were able to do in the fall was to look at new transfer students who started in fall of 18-19 and track them through academic year 19-20. So we're not dealing with individuals who may have started college 10 years ago. We're dealing with individuals who began their educational careers 2 years ago, or transferred to a new institution 2 years ago. As you can see here, the public universities seem to do the best job across the other sectors that we have in the state. And we don't have community college data yet. So 83.5% of new transfer students are retained the next year, and about 2/3 of the new transfer students advance in class status. So what we do see a lot of times is that transfer students have higher retention rates and class advancement rates than new freshmen. So that's something else to take into consideration when we look at this through an equity lens. And here's parallel information, but it focuses on new African-American transfer students. So about 3/4 of the new African-American transfer students at Illinois public universities are retained, and about 56% advance in class status. And at the independent, not-for-profit private institutions, about 57% are retained and about 47% advance in class status. We see much lower retention and advancement rates at the for-profit private institutions. And then there's a small number of transfer students that we track with the out-of-state institutions that operate within Illinois. And they're slightly below the independent, not-for-profit private colleges. And here's parallel information on new Latinx transfer students. And once again, we see a similar pattern. So we're also able to disaggregate the information by low income status. And within the higher ed space, to do that, what we look at is whether or not the individual students received Pell. And what's interesting with the public universities, there's virtually no difference between Pell recipients and those who don't receive Pell in terms of retention rates, which I think is fantastic. And the retention rates overall for new transfer students at Illinois public universities, regardless of whether they receive Pell, are fairly high. There's a slight gap with the for-profit private colleges and a larger gap with the for-profit private colleges. And here's parallel information on class advancement. So once again, this measure looks at whether or not the individual who was a new transfer student was retained, and if they were retained, whether they advanced from being a sophomore to a junior or a junior to a senior. It's kind of our proxy for on-time graduation. And it makes a little bit more sense, and it's a little bit of a cleaner measure for first-time freshmen. But once again, we wanted to apply the same metrics that are new that we created for new freshmen to the transfer population, because the transfer population is often ignored. As you can see here in that when we looked at retention at the public universities by low income status, there really wasn't a gap at all, but there's a moderately sized gap when we look at class advancement. So another thing that we started doing at IBHE was looking at gaps. We thought it would be important to look at traditionally underserved students or underrepresented students relative to either the entire population or the population of students that tend to do quite well. So in most cases, that tends to be the white students. So for these next set of metrics and the visualizations that are included within these slides, what we're using is a direct comparison of different traditionally underrepresented groups to white students. And we're focusing just on the Illinois public universities with this set of slides. And I didn't include the information on new full-time undergraduate students, but I wanted to let you all know that the retention rates of African-American transfer students are significantly higher than the retention rates of African-American first-time freshmen. And the gaps between African-Americans and whites are much smaller when we're looking at the transfer population. So to a certain, and I didn't have enough time to add the information on new freshmen. I didn't know if it was appropriate, but I just wanted to let you all know that that was the case. But there is a gap, about a 10 percentage point gap within the transfer population and looking at African-Americans and whites in terms of retention. And the gap grows a little bit when we look at the class advancement metric. So looking at which transfer students were retained and moved from being a sophomore to a junior or a junior to a senior. And once again, we applied that additional lens and included the interaction of race, ethnicity, and gender, and that there's some slight gender gaps within the African-American transfer population, with African-American females having slightly higher retention and advancement rates. But it's kind of a good thing to do. It's always good to see if there are gender gaps in addition to the race and ethnicity gaps. And then with the Latinx population, what we found was that there really wasn't a gap at all at the Illinois Public University specific to new transfer students relative to retention. And there was a moderate gap specific to advancement. So what this tells us is that the Illinois public universities are doing a really good job keeping Latinx transfer students enrolled. And here's that same information disaggregated by gender. What we see is a slight gender gap within the Latinx transfer population favoring female students. And there's actually a slight gender gap within the white transfer population favoring female transfer students specific to class advancement. You know, regarding retention, you know, everyone was within plus or minus a percentage point or two of each other. So I guess that was the outcome information I wanted to present to you all today. So it does show some gaps. It's kind of exciting. It's new information that never existed before. So in terms of next steps, what we're hoping to do is to move the information on majors of the transfer students into production within a week or so. And I'm going to show you a beta version of the transfer dashboard that includes the information on transfer students. And sometime in the coming weeks, what we're going to do is socialize the retention and advancement information with some of the private colleges to make sure that the information is complete and accurate. And what we're hoping to do is to add those same metrics that I showed you in the presentation to the transfer dashboards before the summer begins. And in doing that, what we hope to do is provide a value add to the field, so institutions know how their students are doing. And institutions can see how their transfer students are doing when they enroll elsewhere. And another thing that we hope to do at IBHE is to potentially identify institutions and the combination of institutions that have better outcomes and smaller equity gaps to figure out what could be replicated elsewhere, or to see what's scalable. Because a lot of times it's hard for us at IBHE to know everything that's going on at the institutions, because it's fairly complex. And the higher ed ecosystem within Illinois, as I mentioned before, is fairly robust. It includes lots of different institutions, lots of different sectors. And you know, to be quite honest, the transfer space is kind of complex, and it is difficult to establish transfer cohorts, but that's something we're attempting to do. Now, without further, I guess I could handle a couple questions now, and then I'll shoot.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest, because we do have people have been very engaged, Eric, with the information you presented, and thank you so much. It's I've made copious notes here, but we do have some questions, and so I thought maybe before we get into your transfer dashboard demonstration, which also in interest of time, we want to make sure you know, we get to these questions. So there was one that was echoed back a number of times, and it was first asked this way: is the state population of white to African Americans factored on the population number of African Americans in the state, or just generalized? And I'll be honest with you, I'm not quite sure I'm following that. How are you? I think they're asking if it's proportional. I mean, you know, is the percentage taken into consideration, the population percentage, when you look at that?
Yeah, it's proportional. I think in that projection chart, it was based on, it was a 100% chart. So it was only looking at proportionality and not actual numbers, but we could provide the actual projected numbers in the future. I think what
Okay.
we were trying to do was simplify the visualization.
Yeah, because one of the other people who chimed in around that question said they were wondering the same thing. And the way they phrased it was, is the state total population ratio by race, ethnicity, addressed in any way in the metrics? I mean, so if you, to me, and I don't have a data brain like you, but to me, that makes me start questioning, like, if it's a lower percentage of a particular race, ethnicity in represented in among the data, is that in part because there's a lower percentage or higher percentage? Like, what is the overall representation of that race ethnicity in the population? How does that factor in?
Right. Well, one benefit of looking at outcomes measures is that it doesn't matter. Once you start looking at outcomes measures and you're not looking at proportionality or changes in the population. I mean, what we'd like to see is that the same percentage of African American transfer students and white transfer students and Latinx transfer students are retained or are advancing in class status. So I think that's one benefit of looking at actual outcome metrics as opposed to looking at the proportionality of students enrolled over time, which is what we've tended to do in the past.
Yes, and we got a resounding little great idea, Eric, to compare those metrics. We also have a question about how is college going defined for recent graduates? Are community college, is that community college or university attendance or both or any post-secondary program? How are you defining college going?
We got that information from the State Board of Ed, and they get it through a partnership they have with the National Student Clearinghouse, which covers about 98% of all post-secondary institutions within the United States. So it covers public, private, 2-year, 4-year colleges.
Okay, community college and university.
Mhm,
Yeah,
mhm,
gotcha.
mhm.
Okay, so, and then one question I attempted an answer, but said that I would check back with you because I almost sure, but I don't want to claim your information. So one person asked, when you were referring to the increase in dual credit, they said for the dual credit informational data, is dual credit high school to college or community college to 4-year? I said, I'm almost positive it's high school to college, but that there are both kinds of dual credit. So I would check in with you.
Yeah, the dual credit as we defined it there would be a high school student. Actually, we defined it as dual credit and dual enrollment. And what we meant was a high school student who's enrolled in college. Now with dual credit, it's a little bit different than dual enrollment. Dual credit is a formal partnership between a high school and a college in which the student is granted college credit and high school credit at the same time, where dual enrollment isn't necessarily as formal. It could just be a high school student enrolling at a community college or a 4-year institution on their own and getting college credit. They might not get the high school credit. So
Okay.
it's high school students earning college credit before graduating high school.
Right, right. So because I think what some people sometimes hear in the world of transfer, we also use dual enrollment to reflect agreements between community colleges and 4 years where the student, guaranteed admission programs where you might be taking, like, say you're enrolled at Parkland College and you're in the Pathways program to the University of Illinois, you might be taking classes on campus too for the 4-year credit. So I think that's the nature of wanting to just be super clear on that terminology. So I think we have, let's see here, we have one more question. It says there are 89 nonprofit private colleges and universities in Illinois. Do you predict different metrics for those schools, and why is tracking difficult?
I guess what we're hoping to do is to create parallel measures that we could use across all sectors. And that's what we've started doing at IBHE. And we do collect student level information that makes that possible from but by default, we're able to do that with the public universities. We're able to do that with the private colleges within the state that are eligible for MAP funding. And we're also able to do it with the private colleges within the state that confer graduate or professional degrees. So there are about 10 private colleges that fall outside of our statutory authority. And we're hoping to get the ILDS Act amended so we could just capture the same information from all degree granting entities within the state to make things easier.
Okay, great. And do you want to make a prediction on whether or not that those metrics are want to put on your your whatever, I don't crystal ball?
Oh, there's no prediction. Yeah, we're gonna have.
Okay, you
we're
are
gonna have,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, because I mean, you know,
Mhm.
as you say, given it's outside your statutory authority. Now, I think what I want to mention next for everybody is that Eric will go ahead and go into the demonstration of the dashboard, but I do want to just remind people that there's a choice of sessions starting at 10 o'clock. And so if you need to, take a break, stay, watch the dashboard thing, and then just make sure that you are able to get to your next session in time. There's, you can go to iacac.org/transfer summit and find the list of sessions, and there are links to join the sessions right there. The 10 o'clock hour offerings are, it's not too early to think about transferring and supporting transfer students through dual degrees and beyond. So, and so thank you so much, Eric. And we are going to make Eric's slides available as well. I believe Aaron or Kristen will collect those from Eric. And again, the session is recorded. So I'm not going to take up any more of your airtime. You can demonstrate the dashboard.
And one thing I wanted to communicate was that we created this because of feedback from individuals at this very conference. So I think it was last year someone suggested, well, could we get more information on the majors of transfer students? So I wanted to communicate the fact that we do take your feedback to heart, and it does drive change in terms of what we do and how we present information. But once again, could you all see it? Dina, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
So what we're doing is just presenting information on the majors of new transfer students. This is only the 2-digit zip code, but what we're hoping to do in the near future is to allow people to drill down into the specific 6-digit zip code, which roughly parallels a major. So in here, we include the information statewide. So this is all transfer students who are new in the fall of 2019. And as we do with the other transfer dashboards, we look at the information from 2 different perspectives. So for the transfer students received at institutions, as well as the transfer students being sent, which largely parallels the receipt when you're looking at the statewide totals, but it becomes much different and much more nuanced when you look at it from an institutional perspective. Now Tableau's taking forever. Okay. Oh, that's not what I got. 1 second. So here's the transfer information specific to majors for the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I think that the true value add of having this information is getting the information on the students who leave your institution and enroll elsewhere. So this information is highly important and doesn't exist elsewhere. For the transfer students who are received at an institution, an institution would traditionally have that because that student's currently enrolled. But I think the value add of having it in the system is sometimes that information doesn't trickle down to people who could use it and benefit from it most. So I think having it from both perspectives, the receipt perspective and the sent perspective, is highly valuable. So it's just some basic information on the majors of the transfer students. And then we did a bubble chart that depicts how many of those majors were within STEM fields, and that's how the Department of Homeland Security defines it. And then health fields outside of that STEM definition, as well as other majors and the individuals that didn't have a major or were undeclared. So we have this. It's interesting. We should have it in the main site within a week or so. But let me know what you think. And as I previously stated, we're going to get the metrics that focus on outcomes up, hopefully by the summer. We need to do a better job of socializing that information with the private colleges. But
I can't wait to dig into them. I'm excited about it, especially the, down to the majors. That is excellent. Thank you so much.
But the outcome information will roughly parallel what I presented in those slides.
Yeah.
Looking at retention, looking at who advanced in class status with some additional disaggregation available.
Yeah. And thank you for the reminder that it is time for me to start pestering Doug Shapiro again to see if we can get that state level data, And just as a side note, Washington, who was our main competitor, they have me present on what we're doing in Illinois. So I think they're still looking to catch up. And I think the quote of the day so far, Eric, is strange things may happen in any given year. When you said that, I almost fell out of my chair. That defines 2020 to a T, doesn't it? Oh my gosh. So thank you, Eric, very much. And thank you everybody for coming to this session. Please don't forget to fill out your evaluations about yesterday's sessions and today's. We really want to hear from you. And as you can see from Eric's presentation, your feedback does have an immediate effect. It does matter. We do listen. So thank you, Eric, and everybody have a great day.